Greetings and welcome to Emsi Burning Glass webinars. Today we're going to be exploring skills gaps in the local economy. Quite an interesting and hot topic at present when you think about it in regards to economic recovery in particular. Bear with me a second. I'm going to be joined by Martyn Gerard, who's the account director within the economic development team. I'm Cookson, director for economic development. A few bits of housekeeping as we're going through the presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to raise those using the box on the GoToWebinar widget. So for those that don't know us, we are Emsi Burning Glass. Emsi merged with Burning Glass at the end of June of this year, and at present we're working on a big program of integration across our data sets and tools, but our mission remains the same, essentially to use labour market data to help people and to inform decision making that they have to make around the worlds of work, education, and more broadly with skills being the context that we tend to focus in on. We're going to move to our kind of usual regular segment in regards to what's happening in the UK labour market. Obviously important context when you think of skills gaps. General picture in terms of unemployment. What we're looking at here on this graph is the unemployment rate, and you can see it's continuing to fall down. This goes up to May, but that trajectory continues when we look at June and July as well. This is 16+ seasonally adjusted. If we then look at the furlough rate, you can really see, particularly if you look at it alongside unemployment, furlough has successfully helped to reduce unemployment and to retain and maintain jobs. It continues to fall, but it's quite interesting. If we go on to the next slide, I should say this goes up to July 2021. If we go on to the next slide here, we can see that there are sector-specific challenges to resolve in regards to furlough rates. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see quite high rates, way above the sector average. If you look across all sectors, the sector average is around just above 5%. You can see there for accommodation and food services, which would include hospitality, arts, entertainment, recreation, other service activities, they're fairly high in particular, which is interesting all the same, and particularly interesting when we start to look at employer demand. So here what we're looking at is we're looking at unique job postings that have been posted and online for less than 90 days. And you can see we're looking at a time period from February 20 through till August 21. And you can see if we look from February this year, 21, see that steep trajectory, which just continues to rise. Obviously, this is looking across the UK and across all occupations. What's interesting, if we look closer and we look at the what I've taken here is I've taken Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland at either ends of this chart, and then in between I've looked at government office regions, and you can see here North East in particular has a huge percentage change, and we're looking at the change between February this year and August this year, so really digging into that growth. UK average is I think around 94%. Obviously you can see the North East there and Scotland particularly high, with Scotland being the highest, coming in at 130% growth over that, or change over that period. So yeah, London obviously is lower than you would probably expect. I think it's about 78%. East Midlands, Northwest as well. So not an equal picture in terms of that bounce back in terms of recruitment activity. And the same can be seen if we start to look at job roles. And it's particularly interesting if we look at these top three here, which all relate to the hospitality sector: bar staff, waiters and waitresses, and chefs. Bar staff's 2,450% up on February this year. Obviously, February this year, we were still in a lockdown. Hospitality in the sector was completely shut down. And since then, we've seen real increase in demand. At the same time, we're seeing furlough rates being particularly high for that sector as well. So there's something that does not quite compute there, and open to ideas if anyone's got any as to what that might be. It does seem that furlough is particularly high, and yet we go past any pub or restaurant and there seems to be a sign out front looking for staff. This could mean that job postings continue to be reposted, and there's a bit of a backlog there. We'll see. And I imagine that as furlough comes to an end, we'll see some of that just bottom out and change. But interesting nonetheless. Really comes into what we need to talk about today. First of all, what we're going to do is we're going to look at defining skills gap. Not quite as straightforward as you may or may not imagine. There's different perspectives that can be taken into account. We're going to it is complex, and depending on the perspective with which you bring, whether on the one side you are the individual, that is the candidate that's looking for work, or on the other side, the employer that's looking to recruit. And we see skills as being the connecting point, the right point whereby the individual's attributes meet the employer's needs. So first of all, looking at it from an individual, useful way to think about a skills gap is really what it means. So it means that some people don't have the right skills for the available jobs. This means that some people are underqualified. It also, by the same measure, means that some people are overqualified for the jobs that they do. Broad estimates suggest that by 2030, nearly 20% of the workforce will be significantly underskilled for their job. Right now, it can mean that finding an appropriate job in a relevant industry is more difficult. And we see this being particularly challenging for different age groups as well. It tends to be that the greatest challenge is for either young people or older people in the workforce. There are some figures that have been quoted stating that 40% of UK workers don't have the right qualifications for their current jobs. These are always open for being questioned and challenged as well. They often make a really powerful headline, but yeah, you will find that there are many different perspectives on what is the right qualification level for UK workers. Essentially, the output and the result of this is that individuals can find themselves being less productive in their work, less satisfied with it, maybe more reluctant to come off furlough and go back to their job, or even in obviously the more extreme cases, out of work completely and unemployed. Now, switching that to the employer's perspective, skills gap essentially means that talent pools are limited in certain areas, professions, occupations, meaning that roles tend to take longer to fill, something employers don't like to have to do. We'll come back to that later in this webinar. And also means that there's a lack of qualified personnel. And this obviously can have dramatic impacts on a business, on an industry, on a sector, can cause loss of productivity, higher rates of staff turnover, much harder to retain staff, lower levels of morale within the workforce, lower output, in the quality of work, really can put the brakes on expansion of a business or enterprise, and ultimately a loss of revenue. So really important issue from an employer's perspective to be able to resolve. Obviously, there are potentially damaging effects from that mismatch of skills. It can also mean that companies can't fulfill demands for customers, whether it's delivering a product or a service. I thought it would be important to mention the Employer Skills Survey, which has been around, I think, since about 2010. It was owned by UK CES, who are no more. The Employer Skills Survey was most recently completed in 2019, so that was pre-pandemic. Tends to be over 81,000 employers participating. That's the number that we had for the last survey in 2019. It's a really good source of insight for understanding the skills challenges faced by employers, both in terms of their existing workforce, but also in terms of when they're recruiting and responding to how they respond to those challenges through whether they are investing in training and workforce development. Obviously, it's a survey. These are all asked questions that tend to be asked of the most senior person in the organisation and the HR lead. Any employer that employs more than 2 people would be eligible to take part. A lot of the survey focuses in on recruitment, what roles employers are trying to fill, where, how many, and what are the problems, what kind of skilled people are required. Key measure that comes up is skills shortages. So that's measured by asking the employers if they have any current vacancies, and if they reported a vacancy, they're asked if they're finding it difficult to fill that position for any reason. So if so, it'll be counted as a hard to fill vacancy. Really important to understand, hard to fill vacancy could be for any reason, so not necessarily specifically about a skills challenge. The survey also focuses in, as you'd imagine, on skills, and they try to get to employers to describe if they're having challenges with bringing in people with the right skills or the right qualifications in order to fulfill the vacancy. And those, when that's identified, that's what's counted as a skills shortage vacancy. So that is as close as you can get, sorry, excuse me, to a skills gap. The Employer Skills Survey also captures trends relating to training, workforce development, which can be obviously used by employers to address skills shortages in the workforce. Ultimately, in short, really useful way of understanding skills, very much focused on the employer demand, only takes place every 2 years. So if we compare it to job postings, which are every day, there's a real lag there. It approaches from the employer side, as I've said, that has its advantages. It tends to estimate the number of vacancies and the skills problems therein by occupation. The skills gap questions, there's different ways of viewing that. They're about the gap between existing staff competence and what the business feels it needs, as distinct to a skills shortage, which is about vacancies. Internal skills gaps can be ambiguous, depending on who you talk to within an organisation. But we'll probably just leave that there. And I think the overall point is it's a useful place to look at if you're trying to understand employers' challenges around skills and how that relates to recruitment and, as I said, investment in workforce development and training. There is some question. We asked ourselves this as well. Do skills gaps really exist? Is it a skills gap? Is it a recruitment gap? Is it? There are plenty of reasons that skills gaps as a term is being focused on and is being talked about. According to some data, it's much more about when unemployment rises. Essentially, it's a recruiter's market, and employers will look for candidates who will be more fussy about the candidates and more demanding in regards to skills, education, experience. And then when we end up with when unemployment drops and we end up with a tighter labour market, the inverse happens, and employers will become less fussy and maybe take on more of that responsibility around workforce development, education, and maybe lower their requirements in regards to the level of experience that's needed for a particular role. So it is fluid, it moves with the labour market. In the UK at least, there are clear signs that there are industries and occupations where there are skills shortages of qualified candidates, and we've seen that in news stories at present. The ubiquitous HGV drivers, which we'll come back to. There's also a data that suggests that although levels of education are higher, there's still that lag in regards to basic skills like literacy, numeracy, and some of the softer skills that employers are looking for. Not that literacy and numeracy are technically soft skills. The role employers have to play in addressing skills gaps through proactive investment in professional learning and development programs is a really moot point. How much of this is a responsibility of the employer? How much of it is a responsibility of the organisations that work to provide skilled people out into our communities? Think of our education providers as one of those. Just before we move on to the kind of more practical element of the webinar, I think it's worth just mentioning why do skills gaps exist. Numerous theories, plenty of desktop research, believe me, that you can do on this, different opinions. It tends to depend specifically on the industry sector and the type of the role, probably stating the obvious here, but the clearer the skills requirements are with a job role, and we'll look at some of these when we get to the next part of the webinar, the more specific the employers will be in regards to what skills are needed. However, there are some cross-cutting themes. Automation, not automations, but automation being a particular challenge to lower skilled jobs and entry-level jobs, which obviously means that where people could potentially have gained employment in those roles, they may well be needing to upskill in order to be able to access different jobs. The gig economy is interesting and challenging for employers in particular sectors that are looking to recruit people in a traditional way, and where actually we're starting to see some programs come into play, which are basically opening up project work or pieces of work or pieces of a role for people to take on in a more informal way, rather than formally recruiting someone to do that job in a full-time basis. Education supply, as you'd imagine, is a cross-cutting issue. That investment in training and workforce development, and to what extent that is taking place, is another factor. The last four here do play to this challenge that's been all over the news recently in regards to HGV drivers, the impact that we're seeing on that have on the empty spaces on shelves in supermarkets, and that is a heady mix of definitely those bottom three, in that migration's a factor. There is a Brexit, potentially a Brexit challenge with this, but also, as we've talked about on previous webinars, we've seen migration happen as a result of the pandemic. There's also a demographics challenge there with an aging workforce, and then there's been the pandemic as well, which has actually probably seen further and increased demand for HGV drivers because of that broader need for logistics. So yeah, the migration, demographics, pandemic, all part of that issue. And then what we've seen is we've seen salaries increase, and we may well see that in other sectors as well. We know that there are currently challenges in social care, for example, health and social care. So we will see one that we will be watching in some detail, may well come back to in future webinars. So that brings us to, and that brings us kind of to the challenge. We've gone through the challenge, we've talked about the context, broadly speaking, in terms of where the labour market is now, and the context in regards to skills gaps. There is plenty more to dig into, so feel free to take your time and do some Google research on that issue. In terms of where we're going to focus in now, I'm going to bring Martyn in, who's our account director for our economic development customers. But we're going to start to look at the indicators. And this is not as straightforward as we might like it to be, is it, Martyn? There are indicators within the tool that can be used. They don't necessarily quantify and wouldn't be able to quantify exactly a skills gap, but they can definitely point us in the direction of where there potentially is a skills gap.
Yeah. I mean, particularly in the Analyst tool, we've got slightly different perspectives, having slightly more up-to-date or real-time data from job postings, so that is able to fill in some of the information gaps we have from things like the Employer Skills Survey, for example, which is historic and also quite vague in its description of the kind of technical skills that people are actually requiring in jobs. So in the Analyst tool, there's much more granularity in respect of job titles and in skills. Yeah.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, I should have mentioned the Employer Skills Survey is technical skills could include a whole range of very specific skills that are needed by employers. And I'd guess that many of our customers would be interested in having a more detailed understanding of what specific skills those employers or those industries are looking for.
Yeah, both by sort of occupation and by industry as well, what the industry specific skills demands are. Yeah.
Okay, I'll move us on.
Okay. So yes, in the Analyst tool itself, there's no direct answer to the question of what are the skills gaps at varying different levels, either regionally or by sector or by occupation. But we do have several indicators that can be indicative of the kind of problems that Will's mentioned before, either hard to fill vacancies or skill shortages. One report in particular, which uses the real-time or job postings type data, is the job posting analytics report. And in those reports, we have a summary for every single occupation, for example, as to what what we call a posting intensity and also the median or average posting duration is for particular occupations. Those two things in tandem can potentially indicate some kind of supply problems. So hard to fill vacancies, for example, might be indicated by the fact that employers are working hard to recruit. So in other words, a higher posting intensity, having to replicate job postings or job adverts in multiple locations to try and get those posts filled. And also the posting duration. So typically in most regions, or for most jobs actually, most jobs are advertised for about 30 days or so on average, for about a month. But any kind of deviation from that, or significant deviation from that number, may indicate that if it's shorter, then the posts are being filled more quickly. But if it's a higher number, maybe sort of reaching about 38, 39, 40 days, that might suggest that there's a problem in filling those posts and potentially even a shortage, skills shortage in some respect. So yes, these kind of things together can act as a proxy for hard to fill vacancies or skill shortage vacancies metrics.
Thanks, Martyn. I'm just going to move us onto the, oh, yeah, that's right.
And also in the same report by occupations, I think we're looking at maybe programmers and software developers here. You also get a breakdown by job title. And again, there's a summary for the job titles as to what the posting intensity is and the average posting duration. And you can see quite clearly that when you put several job titles together, it starts to become apparent which are the standout ones in terms of hard to fill vacancies or shortages. So you can look at some of the net developers, C# net developers, a posting intensity of 10 to 1. So in other words, there's 10 job posts for every unique advert. So these have been replicated up to 10 times is what the data is suggesting there. And then also for the C# net developers, the average duration is 41 days, which is significantly higher than the sort of 31 day average for most job postings. So the two things together there in tandem suggest that there's potentially some kind of recruitment problem in filling those kind of job titles. And also you can see other net developers, Java developers, and some of the PHP embedded software engineers have a similar kind of picture, maybe not quite so high in terms of the posting duration. It's also worth noting for these, particularly in tech occupations, the job titles themselves can be indicative of the kind of skills that people are looking for. So obviously a shortage of Java developers means that Java as a skill is perhaps also keenly sought.
That's really interesting. I think one of the things that we pick up qualitatively and quantitatively is that employers tend to not want to advertise on 10 different websites. Obviously, that comes with an administrative burden. They will go out to as many job sites with their vacancy as they need to in order to fulfill the vacancy. And by the same measure, tends to be employers don't want to have a live job vacancy for more than 30 days. So they are, it's one of those habitual things that in terms of HR practices, which is obviously why it's a useful indicator.
Yeah, you can see those deviations from the norm in terms of that behaviour, yes.
Yeah.
So the other useful information in some of our job reports, so the job postings report by occupations in particular can tell you a sense of the in-demand skills that people are looking for compared to the presence of those skills in the known workforce. And in the Emsi tool, we have a sample of what we call workforce profiles, which are a little bit like online CVs, where people have opted into sharing information about their education history, their employment, and so on. And as part of that, people will say what skills they have. So we have that as a frame of reference, a workforce profile, to see what is the prevalence of certain skills in the workforce and also by occupation. So in this case, we're comparing, I think it was programmers and software developers again. So I think the light blue line is the frequency of that skill found in profiles. And then the dark blue line is the frequency or the times that is mentioned in job postings. So ideally, you want a fairly close alignment between the skills that people are or employers are demanding and also the skills that people have in the workforce. Where there isn't an alignment in that respect, and if there's a significant deviation in that respect, that might indicate skills gaps in the workforce. So skills that are particularly difficult to find in the workforce. And these may indicate the need for upskilling in the role and sort of broader training, generally speaking. And potentially even the conversation might go to education providers even, is that they could potentially spot these gaps and think about educating people more broadly in terms of that occupation. But you could see here in this particular example, maybe Python as a programming language, the percentage prevalence in profiles is a little bit lower than what it is in terms of the rate of people asking for that skill in job postings. It's not an exact science, it's largely indicative, but you can get a sense there as to whether there's an alignment or a mismatch in terms of those key skills. But importantly, with this granular data, you can see exactly which skills those are.
I mean, it's worth mentioning as well, the other way in which you can further your understanding is, obviously we will have employers directly associated with job postings as well. So if you are supporting either in recruitment, which I know some of our customers are, or if you're looking to respond to employer demand, there's potential to have an interesting conversation there with an employer that is struggling to bring people in with the skill set that they need, if you're in a position to be able to help with that supply issue. But yeah, that's another way in which you can further your understanding through to talking directly to employers. Moving on, we've got something new to show people. Is that right, Martyn?
It is, yeah. We've got some couple of new things. Excuse me. On the right-hand side, there's something you may be more familiar with, although it's hidden away in one of our economy overview reports, which is sort of a ranking of, I think it's the top 20 skills over time. So you can see like an aggregate for a region or even by an occupation.
Yeah, this one's by programmers and software development professionals. Yeah,
the top 20 skills being sought after in job postings and how that changes over time. So I think you've got 5 discrete time periods, each of 2 months each. You can see by I think it's called a Sankey chart is the official term, but you can see by following the ribbons for each one of those color-coded ribbons, you can see how the rank order of those skills is changing or not over time. So that's the first part. The other part on the left-hand side is a brand new report within job postings we have, which gives you a sense of hot and cold skills by job postings. So in other words, how the demand for skills has increased or waned over time. I think in this case, we're using data from 2021. So the dark blue line is the number or prevalence of skills in postings at the start of a time frame, which I think was February 2021 in our example. And then the green or the red line indicates either increase or decline by the end of that time frame. So on the top half of the chart, you've got there with the green lines the skills that have increased and the demand for skills that have increased over that time period. You can see those increases compared to the dark blue line. And then theoretically, the red lines is showing where there's been a decrease in that time period in absolute terms. Important to note in this context, yes, we're calling them hot and cold ostensibly, but you know, in absolute terms, the demand for some of those red skills there, like I think it's struggling to see in my glasses, JavaScript, I think is that top red one. Yes, it may have decreased over time very slightly, but it's still, in absolute numbers, it's still a highly sought skill. So,
yeah, high volumes there.
So yes, it is a nuanced thing. We may iterate and refine the way we're presenting the data, but yes, hot and cold skills, just giving you a sense of how demand has changed over time according to job postings.
Really useful for understanding over a time period. As you said, this was focused on 2021, but you could expand that or you could narrow that. And I do think that's probably where the value is in terms of understanding skills, primarily through job postings, all of those indicators. The value is that they are in real time, and we're seeing some really pressing issues in the labour market alongside the recovery as we move out of the phase that we have been in throughout the pandemic. So in terms of tracking recovery, hopefully this will be useful, a useful indicator along with the others that you shared, Martyn. Just wanted to come to see whether we've got any questions. Interesting one here. I would have thought logistics and lorry drivers would have featured in job postings. It does feature in job postings. Obviously, what we were focusing on there were the highest volume, and that is being slightly skewed by by the hospitality need for people in hospitality at present, which doesn't mean that those jobs that we talked about, like HGV drivers, lorry drivers, and other jobs around logistics and warehousing, aren't in high demand. They are. There is national growth within the sector, if you think of logistics, and particularly if you think of logistics and e-commerce. And the HGV one is an interesting one. It doesn't, I looked at this for Wales in the last month, doesn't come through in incredibly high numbers. Obviously, there's a challenge there, and there's a bit of a lag. If you're recruiting a HGV driver, you need them to have the HGV license, and that, I think, is part of the challenge that we're seeing at the moment. But yeah, you would, they will come through in job postings. Do reach out if you want to discuss that or have a look in more detail at those particular roles and how they are coming through in your area. But yeah, interesting question. Just checking what we have here. Have you identified any change in the green skills? Last webinar that we did was very much focused on the green economy, specifically on green jobs. We have green reports at LEP level and for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. If you haven't seen that, do make contact. Our contact details will follow in a bit. Yes, generally speaking, and it would depend on the area, geography we're looking at, but generally speaking, we're seeing, we have seen increased demand for green skills throughout the last year, which, if you think about what the last year has entailed in terms of labour market disruption, is a really clear indicator. And we believe that is because we're seeing green skills becoming part of and being more specified within people's job roles, often connected to carbon neutral commitments, either by employers or by public sector type organisations. So in short, yes, we've identified change. Yes, we've identified a steady increase in demand, and it being more specified in regards to people's job postings and recruitment activity overall. I think that's all of, oh no, can you provide localised and tailored training sessions for schools, career leaders in a particular area? We tend to provide access to our tools. Analyst is the tool that we focus on today. We also have a tool that supports with careers and schools engagement. And obviously, if anyone is using our tool, we'll provide training sessions and support to embed the tool and the use of that tool. So do make contact if you would like to find out more about that. We have been able to provide information outside of that has been used in regards to broader kind of careers awareness activities, but often that's data that's been drawn from either our career coach tool or our analyst tool. I think that's the last of the questions. If anyone has questions and we didn't get to them, we'll respond by email. I should say, for anyone attending, the slides and everything we've discussed today will be shared from tomorrow. So you'll get an email with a recording and with the slide deck and so on. I should also mention that the next webinar that we have is going to be delivered by our I'm trying to remember his job title now that it's changed. It's our global VP, executive VP, Andy Derman, and Duncan Brown, our senior economist, and they're going to be specifically looking at the STEM workforce and what are the emerging trends in employer demand for STEM skills, and particularly over the course of the COVID crisis. So they'll be shining a light on which areas of the country are seeing fastest growth in demand for STEM occupations, which jobs are most in demand, and which skills employers are seeking when hiring for those roles. So not a million miles away from what we've discussed today, but a very different and sharp focus on STEM skills. That's on Wednesday, 22nd of September at 2 p.m. You can register for that through our through the Emsi website. If you look at resources, you'll see webinars there. If you do have any questions, do reach out. If you're a customer and you'd like to talk about skills gaps and specifically how you can get to that and use it within your Analyst tool, do make contact with Martyn. And if you'd like to find out more about the services and tools that we provide, do make contact with myself. Thanks a lot for your time today. We'll be back, I'd imagine, in October with a new webinar. Watch this space. Thank you. Bye-bye.